Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. In the early 1930s, Amelia Earhart overcame numerous obstacles in aviation, becoming a figure who pushed the boundaries not only for women but for all of humanity. The year 1937 represented her greatest challenge, a flight around the world. Earhart was not just a pilot. She had become a symbol in incredibly courageous and determined woman. This flight was not only a technical achievement, but also an important opportunity to prove how successful women could be in male-dominated fields. Amelia approached this project with the experience she had gained from her previous successful flights. In 1928, she made history as the first woman to complete a transatlantic flight, but that was not the end for her. It marked the beginning of bigger goals. In 1932, she crossed the Atlantic Ocean solo, inscribing her name in aviation history. However, this success did not satisfy her. It drove her towards an even greater goal. Her 1937 World Flight Plan was not only a revolution in aviation, but also an effort to expand the path she had paved for female pilots. She aimed to cross the Pacific Ocean and complete her journey around the world. At the time, the first people to complete a world flight were male pilots, but Earhart aspired to become the first woman to achieve this. The flight would begin in California, covering the Pacific Ocean, Asia, Europe, and North America, spanning over 29,000 kilometers. Along the way, she would face many challenges, such as weather conditions, fuel calculations, and technical difficulties. However, she was determined to complete the flight and make history. This world flight was also a turning point in Amelia Earhart's professional life. She was not only in pursuit of aviation innovation, but had become a pioneer of a social change movement. She had become a symbol advocating for more opportunities for women in the workforce and in the world of sports. However, she knew this flight was not only a physical adventure, but also a psychological trial. Constantly changing weather, unfamiliar territories, and communication issues created constant danger. During this journey, she was not only risking her life, but also the lives of future pilots and women. Still, Earhart's determined steps toward this goal showed how courageous a pilot and leader she was. Successfully completing the world tour would have been a victory not only for herself but for all innovative ideas related to aviation. Amelia Earhart was an experienced pilot in aviation. However, the 1937 World Tour was a task no one had ever attempted before. The challenges weren't limited to the distance of the flight. At each stage of this massive journey, there were uncertainties and dangers Amelia would face. Crossing the Pacific Ocean, in particular, was a significant risk. At the time, global radio communication was not reliable, and communication lines were almost non-existent across the ocean. Amelia tried to communicate using radio signals during critical moments of the flight, but these signals often weakened and disappeared. Clear communication between planes was impossible, which made her feel alone most of the time. The communication breakdown in such a vast area as the Pacific Ocean posed serious threats, both physically and psychologically. Nonetheless, Earhart was a leader who had always been able to cope with such challenges. Weather conditions were among the main dangers of the flight. Particularly, the winds and sudden changes in weather could disrupt all her calculations. Controlling her plane under harsh weather conditions required constant attention to ensure there were no deviations from the flight path. Weather data, although crucial for the flight, was not very reliable in the 1930s. Moreover, sudden storms in the Pacific and clouds that completely covered the sky made navigation incredibly challenging. Coping with these obstacles at all times required not only technical skills but also composure and experience. Navigation was another issue. At that time, the systems used to determine the aircraft's position were primitive compared to today's modern navigation technologies, and the margin of error was high. Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, sometimes tried to determine their direction by using only stars and the horizon of the sea. However, even these natural indicators could be misleading at times. Navigation errors, especially in the long and challenging parts of the flight, could have serious consequences. Even a few degrees of deviation could take them far off course and lead to their disappearance. One of the greatest challenges Amelia faced was the uncertainty that filled much of the flight. As she approached the targeted islands, sometimes the entire island could be obscured by clouds, making it increasingly difficult to find the target. During such moments, the time available to reach the target was running out, increasing the pressure. Moreover, fuel was an ongoing issue throughout the flight. Crossing vast oceans like the Pacific, the fuel supply was often a problem. If an unexpected situation arose, or if a longer distance had to be covered, the plane could run out of fuel. Despite all these challenges, Amelia Earhart's courage and determination never wavered. This journey was not just a physical struggle for her, but also a mental trial. Her confidence in herself was heightened by her determination in the face of adversity. She was determined to overcome every obstacle because she wanted this flight to be a turning point not just for her own life but for all women in aviation. No matter how great the challenges were, Earhart was resolute in her goal to successfully complete the journey and make history. On July 2, 1937, Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, were approaching the most critical moment of their world flight. Reaching Howland Island was one of the final stages of this arduous journey. However, not everything was going according to plan. The plane's fuel was starting to run low after hours of continuous flying. Approximately 40 kilometers from Howland Island, under hot, humid weather conditions in an uncertain sky. Everything was becoming more difficult. Up until that point, Earhart had continued her journey with great determination and resolve, but now they were under serious threat. The plane had covered too much distance, and the fuel levels were dangerously low. This put Earhart in a difficult position because, while the island was very close, they needed to find the correct direction to reach it by using up the last of their fuel. At that moment, Earhart sent one last radio signal. This signal was crucial because the signals they would need to find their way to Howland Island were even more important at this stage. For a while, the radio signal was received, and Earhart reported the situation one final time. "I'm having difficulty approaching Howland Island, but I still have control of my plane," she said. This was one of her last communications. Then, the signal gradually weakened and disappeared completely within minutes. From that moment on, it became impossible to know what had happened to Earhart and Noonan. They were flying through an overcast, hazy environment. Navigation had become extremely difficult because the sky was filled with clouds and there were almost no ground markers to be seen. Under these conditions, controlling their course became far more complex. To find the targeted island, they needed to be extremely careful and precise. Unfortunately, in these very challenging conditions, communication was completely lost. The plane deviated from its position, and when the radio signals were lost, it became impossible to say anything definitive about the fate of Earhart and Noonan. Many theories suggested that Earhart and Noonan failed to reach the island and crashed into the ocean. However, at that moment, no one could be sure what had happened. Search and rescue operations began, but soon, no trace was found in the area where the plane had disappeared. As mentioned in Earhart's last communication, she had one final chance to approach Howland Island, but when the communication was lost, everything became uncertain. This disappearance marked not just the end of a flight, but the beginning of one of aviation's greatest mysteries. On July 2, 1937, as Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan neared Howland Island, they were on the verge of disappearance. The last communication carried the hope that everything was still under control, but soon that hope turned into deep concern. As Earhart made her last radio transmissions, there was a faint hint of panic in her voice. "I'm having trouble finding the island, and I have very little fuel left," she said. This was a simple but devastating statement describing their situation at that moment. This declaration in Earhart's voice reflected not only the panic of a pilot in the air, but also the fear that had gripped the world. Reaching Howland Island was one of the most critical points of the entire journey. However, they could not find the island. The radio signals that would help them navigate began to weaken. For a while, when communication was lost, only that brief, final message remained behind. A few minutes earlier, Earhart had sent this important information to the flight control center via radio. At that moment, when every person in the world heard this message, it was clear that something had gone wrong. The communication was, in fact, the moment when Earhart's disappearance began. What seemed like a normal moment suddenly became the harbinger of tragedy. In her final conversations with the plane, Earhart, as she was approaching Howland Island and with radio signals fading by the second, said, "I'm approximately unable to find the island." This sentence, in a way, defined her and her companion, Fred Noonan, a pilot desperately trying to find the island using her last strength amid uncertainty. After this final communication, Earhart was never heard from again. Radio signals completely cut off, and communication could not be re-established. Within hours, great fear and anxiety spread through the aviation world and around the globe. Search efforts were immediately initiated, but unfortunately, these efforts left no trace. From the moment Earhart and Noonan disappeared, one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history was born. With each passing hour, their fate became even more uncertain. At that point, there was no information available about where their plane had crashed or whether they had survived. As the world mourned the loss of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, the lost communication symbolized the uncertainty of this tragedy. Immediately after the news of Earhart and Noonan's disappearance, a massive search and rescue operation was launched. However, this operation quickly showed just how difficult and hopeless it would become. The last known location of their aircraft was approximately 40 kilometers from Howland Island. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the search for any trace covered a wide area. When the plane's radio signal was lost, the search team remained hopeful. The disappearance of such an experienced pilot and navigator had shocked the world. The U.S. government immediately launched a massive air and sea operation. Aircraft, ships, and submarines combed every corner of the waters around Howland Island. However, the vastness of the Pacific Ocean made these efforts even more challenging. The search team had found no trace of the missing plane. As each day passed, more resources were consumed, yet nothing was found. The morale of the teams involved in the operation steadily declined. The search process became a desperate effort. After countless flights and sea journeys, not a single trace of the missing plane surfaced. The lost aircraft seemed to have vanished into the vast depths of the ocean, as though swallowed by an ocean wave. The day-to-night efforts slowly turned into one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. The search team now only watched as Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan remained lost figures. Many theories emerged, but none were supported by solid evidence. Some experts suggested that their plane had crashed into the ocean, while others argued that the remoteness and nature of the area where the plane went missing made finding the wreckage nearly impossible. As days went by, the government's hopes also dwindled. When the search efforts officially ended, Earhart and Noonan's disappearance was declared. This official declaration deeply impacted the entire world. Everyone was waiting for an answer about the fate of these two brave individuals, but no answer came. Despite all the search and rescue efforts, the world was left only with the grim reality of a disappearance. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan had vanished without a trace. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan became one of the greatest mysteries in aviation over the years. As the world tried to uncover the secrets behind this disappearance, many theories were put forward. Unfortunately, none of these theories have been conclusively proven, which only added complexity to Earhart's disappearance. Many people argued that Earhart's plane had crashed into the Pacific Ocean and was completely lost. This theory was particularly supported by the large-scale search and rescue efforts conducted after their disappearance. The vast size of the Pacific Ocean highlighted the near impossibility of reaching the wreckage. Some experts suggested that after the plane ran out of fuel, it crashed into the ocean and most likely broke apart. However, this theory also faltered due to the inability to find any wreckage. In addition, more striking theories about Earhart's disappearance were put forward. Many people suggested that Earhart and Noonan had managed to land on Howland Island, but were later captured while trying to survive. This theory was based on the political conditions at the time of Earhart's disappearance and the Japanese military presence in the region. Some researchers claimed that after landing on the island, Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese and secretly held for many years. However, this theory was also based solely on speculation, and no concrete evidence was found to support it. Another theory suggested that Earhart and Noonan continued to live secretly on a different island after their disappearance. Some sources were filled with rumors that Earhart might have lived for a while after going missing. However, these claims collapsed due to the failure of search and rescue operations and the lack of any signs of life in the region. All of these theories raised different possibilities. However, none of them could provide concrete evidence about the missing plane and the fate of the two pilots. This uncertainty further solidified the legendary status of the missing aircraft and its pilots. Despite numerous investigations, no trace of the lost plane or any solid evidence regarding Earhart and Noonan has been found. Nevertheless, this mysterious disappearance remains an unforgettable question mark in aviation history. Since the day Earhart disappeared, this event has not only remained a disappearance, but also one of the greatest unknowns encountered in the developing years of aviation. Over the years, the mystery surrounding the fate of these two brave figures has grown into a global enigma.